Well. It's great to be here, and just feel so honored to be a part of this. Just a great gathering, and to talk about the music of the greatest to ever do it, and yeah, the greatest. And true to form, D'Angela doesn't know this, but two things really quickly. I teach audio production at a high school in Charlottesville, Virginia. And D'Angela doesn't know that she is the standard bearer for my students. We've been doing a unit on podcasting. And we talk about the hours that it takes to edit. And it's all from the inspiration of knowing what you go through and how you keep us in line. And the other thing was that true to form, when we record our podcast, most of the time, Ricky is off mic, and D'Angela is the one who's keeping him on task. So that is definitely true to form. So, and also I just wanted to quickly shout out my grown folks music folks here, the website Grown Folks Music, that is based here out of Atlanta. I've been writing for the site for almost 10 years, and I've never been here in person. And so along with meeting D'Angela today, I'm meeting some of my grown folks family for the first time since 2009. So it's just great to be here. Without any further ado, as I said, we're going to bring up our first presenter for this panel. And it's going to be Scott Woods, who is the author of Prince and Little Weird Black Boy Gods. And he's an author as well as a poet. So we'll give him a round of applause with Scott Woods.
Thank you, D'Angela, and also all of the volunteers who are working this event. Real quick, yesterday at the end of the festivities, there was a moment out in the lobby when most of us had left, and D'Angela was out there, and she was like eating a plate with like pita bread on it with this 50-yard stare. And so as an organizer of events, I recognize that that end of the day moment when you're like, is this really happening? Is this working? And it's working. So thank you, D'Angela. So I'm going to talk about the Batman project. With context, we don't talk about that much. So this is the movie, this is kind of the conditions around the movie, and as it relates to the soundtrack. So this is kind of the bonus content. Since much of this is about the music, this is kind of the add-on. This is the B-side to all the other conversations that we're having. So Batman came out the summer I graduated from high school. That is me. I was already, although that wasn't 89, it's a little younger. I was already a lifelong Prince fan, already a lifelong comic book geek, and for the hat trick, I was already a Batman fan. Every direction I turned in that summer, I found myself standing at an intersection of fandom. In 1989, there was an enormous amount of buzz leading to the release of the film and for its out-of-left-field soundtrack. The entire venture was riddled with risk and was maddeningly different than anything that was happening in the film industry at that time. Tim Burton was still just some weird director who had just released Beetlejuice the year before. Batman was only his third film. Jack Nicholson was cast as the iconic Joker. Then comic actor Michael Keaton was the titular hero, and the soundtrack was going to be done by the soon-to-be devoutly religious Prince. All of this sounded like a Saturday Night Live skit that shouldn't work. But then photos and merchandise started coming out, the trailer, and everybody lost their collective minds. We were stunned that it looked so legit. Batman looked dark and heroic. Gotham City looked scary. The Joker was Jack Nicholson, which was always a good time, and the only part of the entire project that audiences weren't concerned about. And of course, the Bat Dance video was a bananas mashup of Prince and comic books and ballet and really fake DJ scratching. It was a precursor to a movie that would change the cinematic game. Here's a hot take. None of the think pieces that will come out this year are likely to mention. Prior to this film, Batman was basically trash as a property. Unveiled to the public 80 years ago today, in 1939, so happy birthday, Batman, by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, the character went through a lot of changes over the years. Batman was popular, but not as popular as many other comic characters. In 1966, Batman gets a television show starring Adam West, which ran for 3 years and basically became the only version of Batman most people knew for decades, which was unfortunate, considering the whole show was a farce that played Batman for laughs. At the same time, in the comic book industry, Batman was flailing. His books weren't selling, and his stories were hack and ridiculous. All most people knew about Batman was a campy 60s TV show, and it had all but ruined the brand for anyone who didn't read comics. There was always talk about a movie, but the ideas were bad, the budget's laughable, the property a hot potato of uninterested parties. Batman has no superpowers, and conversely, should have been the easiest superhero to put on screen. And still, no one was biting. No one could get past laughing at Adam West. The irony is that Adam West, his show had saved Batman from being canceled as a comic book, but because of the show's popularity, stalled out expansion into other formats, and market reticence eventually put the comic book back on the chopping block. Batman's fortunes changed when comic artist Frank Miller did a comic called The Dark Knight Returns in 1986, in which he basically reboots the hero, making him gritty and violent and more realistic. There were news articles at the time trying to determine if comics were becoming the new thing to worry about all over again for the 13th time. The 80s was consumed with the idea of kids having their minds warped by media. Same argument you hear today, but with 2,000% less social media. This miniseries changed Batman forever, as well as the work of the entire comic book industry. The comic was a huge success. It was New York Times bestseller. And because Miller's portrayal was significantly more realistic than any portrayal before, talk began anew about a movie almost immediately. You could actually budget and shoot something like The Dark Knight Returns if you were smart. Now, comic book movies weren't new by the time Batman came out, but they were rare, generally bad, and performed horribly at the box office until Superman. Superman came out in 1978, and it was a smash hit, but it was the most expensive movie ever made when it came out. And to offset the risk, its sequels were all poorly done. Hollywood had struck gold once, and then its nature quickly forced it to flush its treasure down the toilet by Hollywooding over everything. They kept trying to make comic book movies at a rate of about one per year, and they were almost uniformly films that should never have been made. Swamp Thing, Supergirl, Howard the Duck, all of the Superman sequels. Yeah, go, just soak it in. Yeah. Hollywood stay making movies based on the opinions of children and people they trap in shopping malls, so they didn't yet know how to make a superhero film that appealed to anything beyond the level of what would make a cool-looking toy. Remember, while Superman was a hit, it was a solid decade plus of haggling and failures to get it to the starting gate. Hollywood was not eager to replicate a headache on that level. By the time work on Batman started in the mid-'80s, it was pretty much the only superhero movie in production. Warner Brothers had little to lose in the action market. By the time they started developing Batman in earnest in the mid-'80s, Superman had stomped out any hopes of making a decent comic book film, let alone launching a genre. If Batman failed, it wasn't the biggest long-term loss in the world. Even at a budget of $35 million, it still cost less than plenty of other films at the time that no one would be doing symposiums about 30 years later. Lethal Weapon 2 cost $50 million to make. Indiana Jones cost $48 million. The Abyss was $43 to $47 million. Back to the Future 2 was $40 million. Batman was $35 million. And Harlem Nights was $30 million. I just like to put that in there. I mention all of this to show you how impossible the Batman film seemed at the time, how ridiculous a proposition it was. And then they added Prince to the mix. Prince's album was coming out on the heels of something that seemed enormously risky. But because it was being done in earnest on every front, the soundtrack took on an enormous gravity by association. The short, non-Wikipedia version of this moment is that the soundtrack was a Warner Brothers push to increase pollination of its artist roster with its movie projects. As was mentioned earlier, there were a few permutations about how this might go, including Michael Jackson for half the songs. But in the end, Prince cranked out the songs before anybody realized how insane an idea it was to have the guy who just released Alphabet Street do an entire superhero soundtrack. The trailer for the movie turned out to be good, which really amped everything up, including reception of Prince's soundtrack. That Prince took it upon himself to fashion an entire album after being inspired by the project in progress is a huge deal. Prince was no stranger to a movie set at this point. This was all happening 2 years after Under the Cherry Moon. By the time Batman is being shot, Prince got the same number of professional films deep as Burton. Still, Prince saw something on the Batman set that was happening that compelled him to do something he had never done before: become a team player on someone else's big studio project. I challenge anyone to point to another instance in his career when he put himself in service to someone else's vision to the same degree. It is equally important to note that the album didn't come out in a musical vacuum either. Half of the album functions as an extension of the Prince we are coming to know, but many of us had started to fall out of love with. Sonically, a lot of Batman is basically Love Sexy the sequel, with the themes and imagery switched out. But there are moments where, in taking a nurture versus nature approach to the music, Prince opted for a rare campaign of nurture, allowing himself to be inspired by what was happening around him musically. Elements of Batman are a showcase of Prince's ability to consume, process, and produce the notable styles of his time, drawing in elements of popular musical forms of the day, most notably electronica, rock, and to a smaller degree, hip-hop sampling techniques and the full-on digitization of R&B, to create something uniquely Prince. Time prevents me from delving into a song-by-song interrogation, so I will focus on the song that truly stands out on the already complex album, Batdance, which happens to be the most blatant example of his magpie tendencies on this record. Perhaps, not unrelated, also his biggest hit in 2 years. Radio stations had an edited version of Batdance that they used that trimmed away some of the odd elements, but it was still Batdance. The song was impenetrable. What do we do to this? Dance for a minute, hop on one foot, play air guitar, have a drink. But you could still put something like that out and have a hit in 1989. This was a decade in which all popular music was weird, as a matter of course. The most outstanding example of this was English electronica band The Art of Noise, who ruled the 80s, were MTV Video Favorites, and interestingly enough, had a hit in 1988 doing a cover of Kiss, yes, with Tom Jones. Their hits were confounding and pioneering in their use of technology, noise, and samples. Close to the Edit, Moments in Love, Paranoia. Max Headroom was an actual thing then, and had a TV show and a hit song done by The Art of Noise at this time. So glitchy sample music was kind of the order of the day. And in a move that tied all of these disparate elements together, The Art of Noise released the hit theme song and video for the movie Dragnet in 1987. The single was basically a Batdance roadmap, down to the mid-song style changes. Let me be clear. I am not saying Prince needed The Art of Noise. I'm saying Art of Noise made music like this marketable. Art of Noise opened a hole, and Prince ran through it on this single. The Art of Noise was selling mad gold records, releasing the kind of stuff Prince was doing in Batdance. It was, in fact, unavoidable. In short, Batdance had some clear cultural, musical, and chart-minded guideposts. It is a wild song, but it wasn't as polarizing as one might think now. It sticks out in his catalog, but it is not so weird for its time. Batdance sounds like all of the 80s in one song, which almost makes it seem like Prince's way of saying goodbye to the decade, a theory not so outlandish considering Batman was his last album of the era. The soundtrack and the movie both dropped that summer, and the world changed overnight for comic book fans, movie fans, Prince fans, and the movie industry itself. The movie legitimized a genre, and Prince had a hit record he kind of needed at the time. This album is a single entry in his catalog. It is definitely a product of its time and the rare Prince work for hire. It fell at a life-changing time in his career and before his relationship with Warner Brothers completely melted down. It is, in many ways, the opera Prince was always threatening to compose. The movie hasn't aged well, but the music still works. And as Prince albums go, it remains a fascinating combination of idea, passions, and agenda. Thank you.
All right, wonderful work by Scott Woods there. It's always great to be able to sit and, learn, listen and learn. And one of the things that struck me in the audience is, just the whole tenor of this panel, which is equal footing for an artist in the studio and live, which is a rarity. Some folks, the live venue is where they shine, and others, with the aid and the assistance of the laboratory that is the studio. But we're talking about an artist here who is on equal footing.